religious belief isn't the problem here. The problem is empire and power. Like colonialism, slavery, genocide, none of these came from any type of divine command. They came from material interests. Land theft, resource extraction, racial supremacy. God at times was just a costume. And like any costume, it came off the second it stopped being useful. Meanwhile, faith, real belief in God has also been a strong tool of resistance. The kind of belief that says if your God tells you to dominate others, it's not God, it's empire. And it's as simple as that. Like God didn't build empire. Empire built its own fake version of what God was to excuse the bloodshed of the empire. Like the only thing that these politicians fear is bad PR. Like they don't answer to anyone. They're like godless and they have no higher authority beyond their own self-interest. Certainly not the public. And like when I say godless, I don't mean like it's not godless in like a religious sense, okay? I mean it in like the quote unquote moral one. There's no external authority beyond their own self interest. Not divine, not democratic, or anything else. You know, like holding these people to account is something that they don't see as like natural to the world that they live in. Like ethics is very much replaced with the optics of ethics, and these types of rituals of bipartisanship, that's what they're like that's what they're used for, is to uphold this illusion. And accountability is outsourced to the market of capitalism, and that's the most important thing, is that the god of the old collective is now this individual god of the market. You know, like a lot of people, I've seen it with a lot of people who argue like God is a colonial violent power, and putting that out as like this kind of like mic drop, like it speaks for, like the statement just speaks for itself. Look at Manifest Destiny, look at slavery, look at residential schools. Obviously, in its own right, it's completely true. But when you contrast it to everything else, it's completely lazy, because colonialism didn't happen because people believed in God. It happened because people had power and believed in power, and then they used God's name as a cover for that power, and then that function adapted into what, like once the church lost its legitimacy, that grouping, like that group connection to a higher thing still existed, but then it adapted towards capitalism because it came malleable by the loss of a collective god. And that's really when like capitalism went global, or like when it really rose. Pointing to Manifest Destiny wasn't religion. It was like a theocratic nationalism with a Bible sticker on it. But there's nothing in the Bible about manifest destiny. The John O'Sullivan 1845 line about America's manifest destiny being to conquer the continent, that's not divine scripture. It's a newspaper headline. There's no theological depth at all. It's just branding for an expansionist colonial project. That's what it was. And it worked because Americans didn't actually believe in God or God's will, right? They believed that they were God's will. That's not faith. That's idolatry. That's the nation turning itself into a god. That's what it was. America becoming a god and moving across the frontier, and using Providence as a PR department, which is, again, civil religion 101. And those things still exist today. It's just adapted into something else. Now, in the argument of slavery, slavery is obviously a very complex issue, especially in the United States. But just for the argument on this point, I'm going to use the United States, because the fact of the matter is that in the US, slavery's biggest enemies weren't secular liberals. They were believers of God. There was a whole lot of slaveholders that twisted Bible quotes to justify their position, sure, but abolitionism comes from, it is a like a critique of the society based on a religious tradition, a religious understanding. Quakers, black churches, literally, like, look at John Brown. John Brown literally thought that slavery was an offense to God that was worth dying to stop, because he knew that if he died, it would be a righteous death. Frederick Douglass, another guy who made it clear that the Christianity of this land had nothing to do with the teachings of Christ. And he was referring to slavery, and he was referring to like the Southern Baptist slave owner. The abolitionist movement wasn't just secular morality. There was that, but the most fervent abolitionists were like full-on religious revolt against a system that was using God as a prop. And if God was inherently pro-slavery, these people wouldn't have had the moral firepower to burn it all down, or at least to start the fire that created the situation where it did get burned down. In the context of residential schools were horrific and churches were complicit, obviously, no question. There's no excusing any of that. The Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches were all agents of cultural genocide within the Canadian state. The uncomfortable difference between these two things is that those churches have since apologized. Pope Francis flew to Massachusetts and begged for forgiveness. The Vatican even, they repudiated the doctrine of discovery. They didn't rescind it, but they repudiated it, right? And it's not redemption in any way. It's absolutely not enough, but at least faith has a vocabulary for guilt, confession, and penance. That's more than you'll ever get from the Canadian or American state. Anything that is done, like when Trudeau apologized for what was done to the Silcotin people, it was all like up for his own political expedience to become a figure that was popular. That's what it was for. The Canadian state reluctantly did it. He and his government brought it to the table because it was a part of their existential survival as a political project, not because they wanted to do it or because it was the right thing to do. And again, the Canadian state will drag its feet on any type of like land back, reparations, and full accountability for Indigenous genocide, or at least they'll do it in some ways, but not in any ways that are material. And I'm not saying that the Catholic Church has done that either, but again, at least they've fully gone back on those things rather than saying like, we're going to make those things good. This like revisionism. And religious belief isn't the problem here. The problem is empire and power. Like colonialism, slavery, genocide, none of these came from any type of divine command. They came from material interests, land theft, resource extraction, racial supremacy. God at times was just a costume. And like any costume, it came off the second it stopped being useful. Meanwhile, faith, real belief in God has also been a strong tool of resistance. Liberation theology, indigenous Christian reinterpretations, black theology, the kind of belief that says if your God tells you to dominate others, it's not God, it's empire. And it's as simple as that. Like God didn't build empire. Empire built its own fake version of what God was to excuse the bloodshed of the empire. And if you're blaming God instead of the people who held the guns, signed the treaties, and cashed the checks in their names, right? Like you're doing the work for them, in my opinion. Like anyone could believe in anything they want, but that's just where I stand on this. I didn't say that they wouldn't do vile shit. I said that when they do vile shit, they look and they reflect, as opposed to either denying. I never said either way if their belief in God makes them do bad shit or not. I'm saying that as a collective, when states were no longer associated with a belief in a higher authority, that states started doing things that were morally bad. And that at least like churches and institutions that represented God, for the most part, have reflected on that and have either said this isn't like this, like these were not of God. These were mistakes that the church has made, not reflections of what God is. But so much of like Canada and the United States as like literal states have never done anything like that. I'm literally not even saying that they're right. I'm just saying that it's in comparison to a godless, like a godless society, a godless state, like a state that isn't represented by a higher authority, doesn't have any type of representation of a higher authority, that it is bad, that it leads to bad things. No, because even with secularism, like look at Cuba. Cuba was secular in many ways, but they believed in a higher authority, which was the project of their like revolution. I'm not saying that it's correct. It's beyond any type of religious function. I'm saying that it served a purpose that once it was removed, it made states as a whole act worse. That's what I'm saying. I didn't say secularism itself didn't make it worse, because look who started secularism? France. But France was still Catholic. They just said there's a separation between church and state. That didn't say that, oh, God is dead, God doesn't exist. It said that there is a separation between church and state. I'm talking about the social function of like a cultural belief in God. Do I think Canada is a hellhole? What's the average age of the first-time home buyer in Canada? There's a lot of things where capitalism has just completely destroyed the fabric of our country because we don't believe in anything besides fucking hockey. Like, yeah. Pretty evident. Yeah, the way that those things developed is essentially because of the way in which individual, like an homo economicus, like the way that people believe that you are worth something by what you have and what you do and like what you make of yourself materially, that is literally a product of the Protestant Reformation. And like your relationship with God is not communal, it's between you and God. And so that removed the group understanding of the society subjected to God, which made it so that people then use the theological understanding of God shows me in the world that there is no sin, because if there was, I wouldn't be able to do the things that I do. That is literally how capitalism developed socially. Like, I'm not pulling this out of my ass. This is a very established, like, theory. God is dead. Niche. Like, it's a very established thing. This is how capitalism was born, was because, like, I didn't say that real God believers wouldn't do bad shit. Like, obviously saying that is wrong, and I didn't say that. People have done horrific things in the name of God, and plenty of them believed it, but the inverse, the smug liberal fantasy that secularism somehow makes states humane, democratic, or morally superior is just as delusional. Like, belief doesn't guarantee justice, but neither does disbelief. The one constant across both of these systems is empire. And when colonial states like Spain or the US said God wills it, they were wrapping land theft and genocide into divine branding. And the conquistadors weren't confused. They just knew theology was useful when they were seizing gold mines and sugar fields. Did some of them believe it? Obviously. But the system didn't depend on any type of like sincerity. It depended on results. God was the costume. Plunder was ultimately the goal. But then, like with secular states, it's the same game. It's just like different trappings. Belgium didn't need a priest to massacre millions in the Congo. They had Leopold and a profit quota. Again, France didn't need a cross to slaughter Algerians by hundreds of thousands. Secularism doesn't make a state peaceful. It just drops the God talk and gets straight to the point. And the high human development indexes in Europe, like, those aren't products of secular moral clarity. They're built on the bones of centuries of colonial looting. Like, the Enlightenment did not create prosperity, it laundered it. If you think the Netherlands got rich off rationalism, or maybe centuries of slave labor in Indonesia, like even Canada, yes, like liberal multicultural Canada is built on unceded indigenous land, resource theft, and US military integration. Its quote unquote secular charter hasn't stopped horrific crimes against indigenous peoples. It didn't stop the siege on Oka. It hasn't stopped corporate welfare or NATO warmongering. So, like, you can't wave the secular charter around like it's some sacred tablet. Like, the only supreme being that there is in Canada culturally is Bay Street, and that's my point. Or hockey. And yeah, individual rights matter, but when they're handed down by wise secular elites, they're clawed out of the state by movements, often full of both religious and secular people. Women didn't vote because liberal philosophers said so. They voted because people fought for it. Like, black people didn't get civil rights because the Constitution had a good heart. They got them because they marched, resisted, and died for it. There isn't moral progress without pressure. So secularism isn't like a savior. It's just another type of ideology that can serve power or resist it, depending on who's using it and depending on the situation. It's not one or the other. I'm just saying, in the context of colonialism in Canada, like how you go from a settler colony that in some places was mixed and communal to the British using smallpox as a weapon. The question isn't, is it religious or is it secular? The question is, who is benefiting, who is suffering? At the end of the day, there's no cross or constitution that restrains empire. It is material resistance that does it. And blaming religion or celebrating secularism or vice versa in the abstract is just letting capitalism off the hook. But if you look at the dialectic of the historical materialism, the way in which capitalism developed was because of there no longer being like a social adherence to a higher power. And then that slowly became individualized, and that slowly became extrapolated towards the market. And that's what happened. It's as simple as that. And again, many people much smarter than me have said this stuff. This is the thing too, like Western Canada isn't just more secular, right? And you can see in the chart here, right? Look at the place that believes most in God in Canada, which is like in the eastern provinces, right? Least believe in God. The places that least believe in God are in the West. You can legitimately track the treaty involvement with the indigenous peoples based on the level of belief in God in Canada. Because if you look at this chart, okay, if you look at the chart where it starts is in Quebec, and in Quebec, you know what I mean? There's obviously there was still like colonialism, like French colonialism, but there's so much more soft assimilation in comparison to Anglo-colonialism, British colonialism, right? British colonialism was violent, but it was still like, in a way, the initial wave of settlements were missionaries and things like that, Catholic missionaries. So like the roots of the project were like connected to the Catholic Church. But then as it moves west, you see more and more godlessness. And the further west you go, the less treaties there are. In British Columbia, there's no treaties. So like this chart proves the point that I was just saying. It legitimately just proves the point that I was saying. Like, and this, I know this because I've studied this. This is something I haven't studied it in any type of academic way. I've studied it just as getting zonked and reading and writing about it. But I know that this is how the Canadian state developed and how it became what it came to be versus what it was. And it's because of this adaptation over time between its relationship to a society connected to God and a state project, settler colonial project that was in one way or another connected to God. Because once it became not connected to God and connected to capitalism, they were like, it doesn't matter, kill them all, get them the fuck out of the way of this railroad. And that was simply how it went. Like, that's how it goes. And Western Canada, because of this, is not just more secular than the rest of the continent. It's the most irreligious region in North America, period.